Then if we come back to the Greek period, where you have all over the Mediterranean, you have these brewing practices, presumably spiking things with, you know, for rituals, and you write about Triptolemus, this figure who was supposed to spread, who's thought to spread grain in agriculture, but also evidence of people, of Demeter being, you know, this deity who's revered across the Greek world. And then you find this real smoking gun evidence, in my opinion, of ergot being involved in the Kikyon, right?
Right. I won't quite use that word as a good lawyer, but I think it is the most compelling data I've seen in my lifetime to substantiate what was an otherwise crazy hypothesis from 1978, that the whole concept of ergotized beer. We've never found ergotized beer, and so it exists in the abstract. I took it upon myself to go through these archaeobotany journals for years and years and years, and eventually started Googling the term ergot in different languages, because I know there's a bunch of words in German, for example. I go through them in the book, like Afterkorn and Mutterkorn, Toltenkorn, Tollkorn, crazy corn. And so knowing that and the lore that exists around ergot, I tried a bunch of different languages, tried it in Spanish, which is Cornezuelo de Centeno, and bit by bit, I found this archaeological site, Mas Catejar de Pontos in Catalonia, in northeast Spain there. And it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. It's this tiny chapel that the archaeologist on site there, and she's been there since 1990, by the way, Enriqueta Pons, she refers to this archaeological site as a domestic chapel. There's this ritual chapel, this ritual sanctuary in the middle of this site where there was a clear Greek presence, because there's a well-known colony on the coast to the east called Emporion. Famous Greek colony from antiquity that I'd never heard of or paid much attention to until a few years ago. But turns out there was this Greek community who went inland. They are involved in this settlement, and they're setting up something that looks like the mysteries. You know, we find terracotta heads that resemble Demeter and Persephone. We find an altar of Pentelic marble in this sanctuary, the kind of marble that could only have originated at Mount Pentelicus in Greece itself. We find bell-shaped crateres, wine containers, showing a parade, a drunken parade for Dionysus, and et cetera, et cetera. And this place is just swimming with the Greek mysteries. And in addition, she winds up finding in the mid-90s a little chalice about this big, 2 inches big, which is in the shape of a very Greek shape called a kantharos. And it's essentially the shape of the cup that was only used by the god Dionysus when drinking. It's a little cup with 2 handles coming out of either side. The point being, it's not a pint glass. It's a shot glass. Why would a shot glass be left in this sanctuary? Well, they were drinking from it. Turns out they were drinking beer. So Enriqueta enlisted the help of her colleague Jordi Tresserras at the University of Barcelona, who had access to a really impressive suite of equipment. And he subjected this chasel to scanning electron microscope and optical microscopy. And I'm not going to bore you with the rest, but they find beer. And they don't just find the residues of beer in essentially a shot glass, which should, you know, raise question marks almost immediately. They find the remains of ergot, the organic remains of ergot in this tiny chapel. And so there, in the middle of nowhere, where nobody's expecting it and nobody's looking, we have organic evidence for ergotized beer that, by the way, goes back more than 20 years. And the only reason people never heard of it is because Enriqueta publishes her findings in Catalan, in a giant monograph in Catalan, not a widely spoken language. And Jordi, I think he writes about it maybe once in a journal I found from the year 2000, but it's just not widely reported for one reason or another. And it sits there for 20 years. It's absolutely extraordinary.
And you got to show Ruck this evidence, right? What was his reaction?
That was a great day. He sat there for an hour looking at this thing, and he's very pensive. And I say, Carl, you're killing me. Like, what do you think of this thing? And eventually, it's funny. I read it in the book word for word as he says it. And he's such a brilliant guy. I mean, he talks the way that, you write if you focus your attention. I mean, if you spend an hour, you couldn't have written something that came out of his mouth extemporaneously. It was beautiful. So I won't try and paraphrase him, but he says essentially what I told you about the shape of the cup essentially says it all, and the size of the cup is indicative of the fact that this, whatever was happening in this sanctuary, was not a cocktail party. It's not the kind of cup that lends itself well to a party. There was something sacred, ritualistic about this container, obviously something sacred about what was in it, given the environment. And he says it seems to support the idea that, some kind of mystery tradition was being celebrated for Demeter and Persephone, because all the clues are there. And he, I asked him, so what does this mean? What does this actually mean for the history of Western civilization? And he says something about, we ought to not be embarrassed by it, ask more questions, and essentially come to terms with this irrational component that seems to have helped fuel the mysteries, at least in Iberia. The big question we have left to answer is the relationship from there back to Greece and Eleusis, which is ripe for investigation.
Right. And so, yeah, as you say, I mean, this is on the Iberian Peninsula rather than in Greece. But I guess we have this image of it being part of the Greek world, right? And also maybe I've heard you talk about this almost being like ayahuasca tourism today, where some people can't afford to go all the way to Peru. And, so things pop up locally, right, in Europe and North America. And it makes sense that this Greek mystery tradition would pop up in places outside of Greece, in the Greek-speaking world.
It does, and I make sure to include a couple scholars who write about that in my chapter 7. This isn't my idea. It's a relatively unknown site to this day, Mas Castellar de Pontos, but I think it's fair to say the Greek influence is undeniable. I think that's a very fair word, and looking to other scholars too, the very few who've taken a look at this, but they point back to your original intuition about the fertility rites of Demeter and Persephone. They point to those as the kind of rites that would have been co-opted or adopted by the indigenous local community in Iberia, because it's just so, like primordial or chthonic, you would say, using a Greek word, that this idea of tapping into the metaphysical forces of nature, Mother Nature, is seemingly universal and seemingly very, very archaic. And so they're the kinds of Greek rites that would have made sense to a local Iberian population, one who, you're right, could not afford to trek all the way to Eleusis 2,200 years ago. This site dates to the 2nd century BC. It's not that easy to get to Eleusis from Iberia in the 2nd century BC. So there are others, Denise Demetriou, is it, who refers to this as potentially an open access sanctuary. So a place where the formalities of cult were not quite present, and folks weren't looking over your shoulder trying to control what in Greece, by the way, would have been an absolute sacrilege, celebrating these mysteries outside the temple at Eleusis. It was a sacrilege. And so, but maybe here we can see elements of that happening.